She didn't knock. She didn't call. She just walked into my kitchen one Tuesday morning, set her reusable grocery bags on my counter, and started rearranging my cabinets like she owned the place. Which, I suppose, was exactly what she intended. My name doesn't matter as much as my story does. What matters is that I am 63 years old. I have lived in my house on Clover Hill Road for 31 years, and I raised my son in that house after his father passed. I planted the rose bushes along the front walk myself, one spring afternoon with dirt under my fingernails and tears I hadn't finished crying yet. I painted the kitchen that pale yellow because it reminded me of mornings I wanted more of. That house was not just a house. It was every decision I'd made to keep going. And then my son brought her home. Her name is Vanessa. His name is my son, and I love him. And that love is exactly why what he let happen hurt me the way it did. It started small. That's always how it starts, isn't it? Small enough that you think maybe you're being too sensitive. Small enough that you talk yourself out of saying anything because you don't want to cause trouble, don't want to be the difficult mother-in-law, don't want to give her anything to complain about. They'd been married 2 years when my son called me on a Thursday night. He said things were tight. He said they just needed a few months to save up, get back on their feet. He'd taken a new job that paid less initially, but had long-term potential. Vanessa had left her position at the marketing firm because, as my son explained it, the commute was really affecting her wellness. I told him they could stay in the guest room, just for a few months. He said, "Thanks, Mom, you're the best." And I believed him because I wanted to. They arrived on a Saturday with a moving truck. I want to be honest about this part. I want to be honest because some of you are going to ask why I didn't say something then, and the truth is, I was surprised. I thought they meant boxes and suitcases. I didn't think they meant a sectional sofa and a smart television and approximately 40 houseplants that Vanessa said she couldn't leave in storage because they were living things with feelings. I stood on my porch and watched 2 men carry a velvet couch the color of a bruise through my front door, and I told myself it was fine. Temporary, a few months. The first week she moved my dish rack. I know that sounds like nothing, but I had kept my dish rack in the same spot beside the left sink for 27 years. It made sense there. Water drained directly. I had a rhythm. I came home from my volunteer shift at the library that Monday and the dish rack was on the opposite counter, angled in a way that made no practical sense, and when I gently moved it back, she looked at me with this patient, almost pitying smile and said, "Oh, I actually think it works better over there. Better flow." I put my purse down and I made myself a cup of tea, and I did not say what I was thinking. That was my first mistake. Within 3 weeks, she had replaced my hand towels, removed the cross that hung in the hallway. She said it made her uncomfortable, and reorganized my pantry into a system I couldn't navigate. I went looking for my paprika one evening and spent 10 minutes opening and closing doors before I found it behind some grain I'd never bought, labeled in her handwriting. My son was never home when these things happened. He worked long hours, he said. He was tired when he got back. He needed to decompress. I started noticing that Vanessa had opinions about everything. About how I loaded the dishwasher. About the throw blanket on the couch that she said was very grandmotherly. About how I watched the news at 6 o'clock with the volume at a perfectly reasonable level. She started talking about our space and our routines, and I noticed slowly that the hour never included me. One afternoon, I overheard her on the phone. I wasn't trying to listen. I was coming downstairs to get my reading glasses, and I heard her voice in the kitchen, clear and flat. She was talking to someone, her sister, I think, and she said, "She's always just here, like, it's our home now, but she doesn't seem to get that." I stood very still on the 3rd step from the bottom. Our home. I let that sit in me for a moment. Then I got my reading glasses and went back upstairs, and I thought about my husband, who had died 11 years ago, and how he always said I was too patient. He meant it as a compliment. I was starting to think he was warning me. I decided to talk to my son. I chose a Sunday morning when Vanessa had gone to her yoga class. I made coffee and set out the good mugs, and I sat across from him at the kitchen table. My kitchen table where he'd done his homework for 16 years, and I told him I was feeling a little pushed out. I used gentle words. I was careful. I said I just wanted us all to be comfortable. He looked at me with an expression I recognized. It was the same expression he'd used at 14 when I told him he needed to clean his room. A kind of tolerant exhaustion. He said, "Mom, she's just trying to make it feel like home. I said, "It is my home." He said, I know. I'll talk to her." He didn't talk to her. Or if he did, whatever he said changed nothing. Because the following Friday, my neighbor Bettine came over for coffee and asked me why there was a combination lock on the cabinet in the utility room. I didn't know what she was talking about. I went to look. There was, in fact, a combination lock on the cabinet where I keep my important papers, my insurance documents, my mortgage records. I stood there looking at that lock for a long time. I asked Vanessa about it that evening. She said she'd put some of their private documents in there and just felt more secure having it locked. I asked why she'd used my cabinet for her private documents. She said, "Well, there wasn't really anywhere else." I said very calmly, "The combination, please." She gave it to me. But the look on her face when she did, like I was being unreasonable, like I was the one intruding, that looks stayed with me. That was October. By November, I was waking up in my own house feeling like a guest. She'd started leaving notes, little sticky notes, in her rounded, deliberate handwriting. One on the refrigerator that said, "Please don't buy the large egg cartons, we're trying to reduce waste." One on the bathroom mirror that said, "Reminder. Scented candles trigger migraines." One on the front door that said, "Shoes off, please. House rule. House rule." I took that one down and I held it in my hand and I thought about all the years I'd spent in that house. The Christmas I'd stayed up until 2 in the morning assembling a bicycle for my son, so it would be waiting for him in the morning. The summer I'd repainted the porch by myself because I couldn't afford to hire anyone. The winter after my husband died, when I'd sat at that kitchen table for 4 days barely eating, and then I'd gotten up and kept going because I had a son to raise and a house to keep, and I was not going to fall apart. I threw the note away. I started making plans to visit my sister in Asheville. She'd been asking me to come for months. I thought the distance would do me good, and honestly, I thought it might do the house some good too, give everyone a chance to remember whose name was on the deed. I left on a Wednesday. I told them both I'd be back in 10 days. My son hugged me goodbye. Vanessa waved from the couch without looking up from her phone. I was gone for 9 days. I came home on a Friday afternoon with a jar of local honey my sister had picked out and a lighter feeling in my chest, like I'd remembered something about myself out there in the mountains. My key didn't work. I stood on my own front porch and turned my key in my own front lock and nothing happened. I tried again. I checked that I had the right key, which was a reflex I immediately felt foolish about. I had one key. I had carried it on the same keychain for 15 years. A little brass pelican my husband bought me in Florida the year before he got sick. The key didn't work because the lock had been changed. I sat down on the porch steps. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that Bettine from next door noticed my car in the driveway and came out and found me sitting there, and she brought me inside her house and made me tea, and I told her what had happened and she said, "Honey, you need to call a lawyer right now, not tomorrow." I called my son first. He answered on the 3rd ring. I told him very quietly that my key did not work. There was a pause. He said, "Oh, yeah. The lock was sticking, so we had it replaced." He said he'd bring me a new key. I said, "Where is the key right now?" He said he was at work. I said, "And Vanessa?" Another pause. He said she was home. She was home, in my house, and had not left me a key. I asked Bettine if I could use her phone book. It took her a moment to find one. I looked up a locksmith, and I also looked up the name of an attorney I'd heard mentioned at church, a woman named Aldine Foster who handled property matters. I called the locksmith first. He arrived within the hour. I stood on my porch and showed him the deed I had photographed on my phone before I left for Asheville, because something had told me to do that, some quiet instinct I was grateful I'd listened to. The locksmith changed the lock. He gave me 2 new keys. When Vanessa opened the door, she'd apparently watched the whole thing through the front window. She stared at me with her mouth open and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Coming home." She said they had things inside. I said I was aware. She said she was going to call my son. I said that was fine. My son arrived an hour later. He stood in the living room and looked between his wife and me with that same exhausted expression, and I could see him trying to figure out which of us he needed to manage. And I realized, standing there, that I had spent too many years waiting for my son to choose me. I wasn't waiting anymore. I said, "I need you to sit down." He sat. I told him that I loved him. I meant that. I told him that what had happened to the lock, whether it was intentional or not, was not acceptable. and that the changes Vanessa had made to my home without my permission were not acceptable, and that I had spent 3 months making myself smaller in my own house, and I was done doing that. He started to say something about the lock sticking. I said, "Please don't." There was a long silence. Vanessa said, from the doorway, that I was being dramatic, that I was making them feel unwelcome, that she had tried very hard to make this work, and I had never appreciated that. I looked at her. I thought about the dish rack, the cross in the hallway, the sticky notes, the combination lock on my cabinet, the 9 days I'd been gone and she hadn't thought to leave me a key. I said, "I'd like you both to start looking for another place to live. I'll give you 60 days. That's more than fair." Vanessa said something sharp and walked out of the room. My son looked at his hands, then he looked at me, and I saw something shift in his face, not agreement, not yet, but something like recognition, like he was seeing the situation clearly for the first time. He said, "Mom, I'm sorry." I said, "I know." That night, after they'd gone to their room and closed the door, I moved the dish rack back to where it belonged. I hung the cross back in the hallway. I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat at my kitchen table in the quiet, and I thought about my husband, and how much he would have hated all of this, and how much he would have loved that I'd finally spoken up. The next morning, I called Aldine Foster's office and made an appointment. I wanted to understand my rights clearly, have everything documented, make sure the 60 days was formal, and not just something I'd said in a heated moment. Her assistant told me she had an opening Thursday morning. I also, while I was thinking about it, called my financial advisor. I had been meaning to update some of my estate documents anyway. There were names I was reconsidering. I won't pretend the 60 days were easy. There were tense dinners and slammed doors, and one afternoon where my son sat across from me and cried and said he felt like he was being forced to choose. I told him no one was forcing him to do anything. I told him his wife was welcome in my home as a guest. But guests don't change the locks. Guests don't put combination locks on cabinets. Guests understand that they are guests. He found an apartment. It took him about 3 weeks, a 2-bedroom in a complex not far from his office, reasonable rent, a short lease while they figured out their longer-term plan. He told me about it over the phone, not in person, and his voice was neutral in a way that made me think Vanessa was nearby. They moved out on a Saturday. My son carried boxes, Vanessa directed. Neither of them spoke much to me. When the last box was loaded and my son paused at the door, he looked like he wanted to say something. He didn't. I said, "I love you. I'm here whenever you're ready." He nodded. He left. I stood in my doorway and watched them drive away, and then I went back inside. I walked through every room. I straightened the throw blanket on the couch, the grandmotherly one. I found one of Vanessa's sticky notes still on the inside of a cabinet door, left behind maybe accidentally or maybe not. It said, "Use by dates matter." I peeled it off carefully and dropped it in the trash. Then I called Bettine and asked if she wanted to come over for coffee. She said yes. She brought a coffee cake she'd made that morning, like she'd known I'd call. I set out the good mugs and we sat at my kitchen table with the winter light coming through the window, and she asked me how I was feeling. And I thought about it honestly before I answered. I said, "Like myself." And it was the most true thing I'd said in months. My son called 2 weeks later. "Just to talk," he said. We spoke for almost an hour. He didn't bring up the apartment or the move or Vanessa. We talked about a documentary he'd watched, and about his father, and about what I was planting in the garden come spring. It was the best conversation we'd had in over a year. I don't know what happens next with him and Vanessa. That's not my story to tell or manage. I hope he's happy. I hope she becomes someone kinder, or that he finds the courage to ask for what he deserves. I can hope for those things without tying my peace to them. What I know is this: I have lived in my house for 31 years. I planted those rose bushes myself. I painted that kitchen yellow because I wanted more mornings that felt like that color. And I am still here. The lock on the front door works fine. I have both keys. One on the keychain, with the little brass pelican, right where it's always been.